thrilled to welcome to the stage Casey Sherman, who I am going to interrogate mercilessly about his brand new book, A Murder in Hollywood. Casey, welcome to the stage. All right, y'all, we got a lot to talk about, and we are going to dive right into the murder and mayhem, because I don't know about you, but those are two of my favorite topics. And old Hollywood is a close third. Cary Grant was my first crush. I read Lana Turner's memoir, and so when I saw this book come out, I was so excited to A, read it, and to have the chance to grill the man behind the pages. So I'm going to talk to Casey for about 30 minutes, and then because I know that I don't have all the best questions, I'm gonna shut my pie hole and let you guys ask your questions, because that's what you're here for, to connect with authors. So Casey, first of all, tell us why this murder. As true crime writers,
Sure.
There's an infinite number of murders that we could write about. Why'd you choose this one?
Well, you know, going all the way back, you could say that I was kind of born in blood. I call myself the accidental author. I never believed I'd be writing, books of any kind one day, but that is until I was thrust into the spotlight because of my work on one case, one of the biggest cases in the history of American crime, the case of the Boston Strangler. Now, for me, that wasn't just a theoretical exercise, that was very personal. My aunt, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, was the youngest and final victim of that notorious 1960s murder spree. And I reinvestigated that case as a young journalist. That became the first book I ever wrote about. So I always, Sara, leaned into the victims and victimology and what their stories were.
Wow, Casey, I had no idea. So would you say that that is what sparked your interest in true crime?
I would, I'll tell you, I like to read anything but true crime because I live it. It's a little too scary for me to write. But when I get, down into the weeds, I call myself kind of an archaeologist of words. I love the research. That's really my background as an investigative journalist. And it's always trying to connect the dots that may have been missed, whether it's a crime that happened 6 months ago or 6 decades ago.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about your research process and connecting those dots. So I am a research nerd and a history nerd, and I want to know every single thing. So first of all, how long did this book take you?
So, the book took me a year to write and research. At the same time, I had just written a book called Helltown, which many of you have read in the audience. Thank you for that. Helltown's about a serial murder case on Cape Cod. True story. It's one of the most gripping and macabre serial murder cases in American history. And when I published that book and it became a kind of a big hit, my agent said, "You need to write something, equally as big as that murder case." And he sent me, 10 stories of different crimes throughout history. And we ended up landing on Lana Turner in 1958. Now, my only, viewpoint into Lana's story is that I saw her played on the big screen in LA Confidential, one of my favorite films of all time. But I love LA noir. I love, Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and James Cain. So I thought, if I can add something new to that bibliography, I'm all in. So the research took me on a journey from Boston, where I write most of my work, to LA, and I spent a lot of time out there, but never really as a researcher, and chasing history, following in the footsteps of what Lana Turner had gone through in the 1940s and 1950s, and then trying to get all the primary source documents, Sara, like you do. That's what we kind of depend on as true crime writers. Who can we talk to? What can we read? What are the the murder crime scene reports? What do the crime scene photos look like? And they all end up lending itself to the narrative.
So I read in your author's note, which I actually read first. I always read the acknowledgments in the author's note first, that you went to the actual restaurant where Lana Turner and her gangster boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, had their very own booth, which is still memorialized with a plaque. So you not only pulled those firsthand documents, you had a firsthand experience. You sat in those seats. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think I need to, as a writer, I need to look, touch, and taste it. So the restaurant you're referring to is a place called Cafe Formosa, which is actually in LA Confidential if you ever watch the film. But that is an old-time Hollywood restaurant. And yes, there is a booth dedicated to Lana Turner and Johnny Stompanato. And I just wanted to get the vibe of what that place looked like, so many years ago. And then, standing outside of 730 North Bedford Drive, where this killing happened in 1958 that Lana Turner was involved in, and standing across the street and trying to visualize what had happened in 1958 at that very moment. Now, people probably thought I was a stalker or a nut just standing there looking at this house, but fortunately nobody called the cops on me, which was great. But I think that, as I said, if I can visualize it, I can hopefully have my reader visualize it as well.
So are you a stalker or a nut?
No, but as I said, what Lana means to me, I'm very paternal about her. I've got 2 daughters, and I wanted to give her her voice back and give her her agency. Lana Turner has been described as a femme fatale and a villain in Hollywood history. She's not. The research that I dug up and found about her, she's really a feminist icon, Sara, and she's a pioneer of the hashtag #MeToo movement, and I think this book hopefully will elevate her to that position.
Yeah, so I noticed again in that author's note that you describe her as a feminist hero and a pioneer. Tell us what you mean by that and why you think she is.
She's a survivor. Now, I write a lot of organized crime books. I mean, that's a world I know. I knew Whitey Bulger. I know that world. And I write a lot about that in The Murder in Hollywood because basically it's 2 worlds colliding. Hollywood filmmaking and organized crime. And it really collides with Lana Turner. I was aware of the Mickey Cohens of the world and the Al Capones of the world and the Bugsy Siegels of the world, who are all in the pages of A Murder in Hollywood, but I was unaware of the crimes being committed at the studio level by studio executives preying on young actors, both male and female. And Lana Turner was 15 years old when she was discovered in Hollywood, and it's the most iconic discovery story in Hollywood history. She was sitting at a soda fountain and discovered by a talent scout. Now, that story eventually, got into the newspapers, and it led hundreds, if not thousands, of young women to, take whatever money they had and, fly or go by train or bus to Hollywood hoping to be discovered. But when you peel back the onion a little bit, that story isn't as Cinderella-like as we think. She was discovered by basically a pedophile. A 40-year-old man who used to just go to a malt shop to ogle high school girls that were cutting out of class at Hollywood High School. So that's where her career starts. She was called the sweater girl early on in her career because at 15 years old, she was put into very tight clothes and wasn't given any dialogue, Sara. She was told by directors, walk from one end of, the set to the other, and we're just gonna, follow your figure. So she was, sexualized very early. One of the things I found out too, Sara, was that at 16 years old, the studio, and this was MGM Studio, which was cranking out, family-friendly movie after family-friendly movie, they had their lead actors of the time, including a 29-year-old Ronald Reagan, dating 15-year-old Lana. That wouldn't happen today. Ronnie would be drummed out of Hollywood. He would have never had a political career after that, and he wasn't the only one. There were several men preying on these young actors. You look at Sara, Judy Garland, who I write about in the book as well. Judy, obviously, we know what happened to her when she died in her 40s, drug and alcohol dependent. Well, the studios had her hooked on drugs at 14 years old so that she could work 70-hour work weeks. And they had her on diets of cigarettes and chicken broth so she wouldn't gain any weight. So it's amazing that Lana, survived all of this and came out the other side.
And unfortunately, Lana's survival doesn't begin in Hollywood. She had an incredibly violent, abusive, and abandoning childhood, and maybe that set the stage in her nervous system to accept that down the road, accept that sort of treatment down the road. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, that's kind of how I start the book. I wanted to figure out, why did Lana Turner have 7 husbands who were mostly all abusive? Well, her father was the victim of an unsolved murder back in San Francisco in the 1930s. He had gone out to get money to buy Lana a bicycle for her birthday, and he got into a card game. He won, but they didn't allow him to leave with his winnings. They rolled him, they killed him. Nobody was ever, arrested or charged with the crimes, and that led Lana and her mother to take a ride from Northern California to Southern California. But she always had this abandonment and this need for some type of father figure. And I think she always stepped in, she made a lot of mistakes, but I think she always was, attracted to darkness as opposed to light.
Why do you think she was attracted to darkness?
I think the void. She had to she was the caregiver and the breadwinner, at 15 years old for her mother. And, when she fell in love, everybody took advantage of her. Every husband, they took advantage of her financially. They took advantage of her body. They took advantage of her psychologically as well. And she was, that traditional battered spouse. And again, going back to, well, why did she have 7 husbands? Now, I go back to her morality contract with the Hollywood studios in the 1940s, which was unlike anything that the male actors had to deal with. Lana couldn't just date somebody. If Lana liked somebody, she had to marry that guy. And she gets stuck in these really abusive relationships that ultimately led to a gangster named Johnny Stompanato dead on the floor of her Beverly Hills mansion on Good Friday, 1958.
On a pink carpet.
On a pink carpet. And if you've ever, we talk about primary source documents, looking at crime scene photos and everything you can find, Google Lana Turner crime scene, and one thing will strike you immediately is the lack of blood in that bedroom.
Yeah, the lack of blood is interesting, because usually stabbings yield blood.
An abdomen wound like that is a very bloody crime. I've been an investigative journalist for 25 years. I've covered 200 homicides. And especially a stabbing like that, it's a very bloody crime scene, but there isn't a drop of blood in those crime scene photos. And Johnny Stompanato looks like he's, a mannequin or a prop on a Hollywood movie set. He's just laid out there like Frankenstein. And I'm like, people don't fall that way when they're stabbed. But, that's, kind of what leads us to this mystery that surrounds Lana Turner and a murder in Hollywood.
Yeah, sometimes justice is not served in the court system.
Not then. When Lana was dating this gangster, and again, she didn't know he was a gangster when she first met him. He had an alias. This was well before the internet, as you all know. So Lana thought he was an importer-exporter, handsome guy. He was certainly somebody that, charmed her, would buy her extravagant gifts, which he had no money to pay for. He was bankrolled by Mickey Cohen, who was the godfather, basically, of LA at the time. And Mickey was basically the Al Capone of Hollywood. And, part of my book follows his ascension to the leadership level of organized crime in LA. And there's a lot of shootouts and bombings and things you'll read about in A Murder in Hollywood, but he survives all of that. And he goes to prison for tax evasion, which is what Capone was sent away for. And when he gets out, Sara, he doesn't want to, live his life by the knife or the gun anymore. Instead, he wants to extort all of Hollywood's biggest power players, including Lana Turner. And when I mean that, what he would do is he would put these actors into compromising positions, film them, and then blackmail them. People like Liberace, people like Merv Griffin, who couldn't love who they wanted to love. In 1956, they were blackmailed by Mickey Cohen. And Mickey Cohen set his sights on Lana Turner and used Johnny Stompanato as the tip of that spear.
I think that was one of the things that surprised me most in your book. Having read Lana's memoir, I did not realize that she was systematically targeted, that, Mickey Cohen and Johnny Stempanato sat down and said, there's our next target, and here's how we're going to get her, and we're going to spend all of these many months researching and learning her favorite foods, and her favorite drinks, and her favorite jewelry, and her favorite flowers, so that we can, really groom her to being vulnerable. It had seemed from her perspective as though this man appeared, but that was not the case.
And she was vulnerable. She was kind of an easy mark. Their first target as an actress was Janet Leigh, Marion Crane from Psycho, and Janet Leigh wanted nothing to do with Johnny Stompanato. But Lana was in a very vulnerable space and time for her. She had just been fired by the studio that helped her build her career, and then she basically ran the studio for 10 years as their, top female star. So they fire her because she's aging out. And she's 36, 37 years old. And she has to pass the baton down to Marilyn Monroe. And she becomes a mentor to Marilyn. I write a little bit about that in the book. And when, Lana ascended as kind of the queen of Hollywood, she had to grab that baton from Joan Crawford, who wasn't about to give that up. Joan was a mean bee. She was tough. Lana, was very endearing, I would say, especially to Marilyn Monroe. And going back to the violence that Lana had subjected herself to, remember, 1957, if you were in a bad relationship with your spouse or your boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, you couldn't go to the police and get a restraining order. Those didn't exist at that time. They would have told you, go back home and settle this, because that type of conversation, isn't polite. So Lana was really painted in a corner.
Yeah, because it was most important to be polite.
Correct. And meanwhile, again, every actor in Hollywood lived by other rules. Lana also was trailed by the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was always trying to find dirt against Lana Turner. She had dated an African-American jazz musician in New York City, and that was frowned upon. That was a violation of her morality clause in her contract. The FBI trailed this couple from hotel to hotel, built up a dossier, sent it to Louis B. Mayer at MGM, and she was almost fired. So she was always victimized in some way, shape, or form. But what I love about her is, in 1957, she gains her power back, well before she sticks a knife in Johnny Stompanato. Lana starts her own production company. Now, no one in Hollywood no actress was doing that at the time. Lucille Ball, for sure, but she had Desi Arnaz as her partner. Here is Lana creating something and gaining power at a time where she could have been cast out of Hollywood. And then she gets confronted with the ultimate evil, who is this boyfriend who she realizes is ready to extort her and potentially kill her. And I write about all of that. That takes place on Oscar night 1958, just after Lana has lost Best Actress to Joanne Woodward, I believe. But it was the greatest night of Lana's professional life because she was finally validated by her colleagues. And she doesn't take Johnny Stompanato to the award ceremony, which was kind of a big insult to Johnny.
She took her daughter.
Yeah. 14-year-old Cheryl Crane, who plays a big role in this story. She takes her daughter. It's a beautiful night, as you know, Sara. They're dancing, they're laughing, they're meeting Cary Grant, Sean Connery. Finally, at the end of this night, almost like Cinderella, Lana gets back to her bungalow in Beverly Hills, puts young Cheryl to bed, walks into her bedroom just to kick off her shoes, and who's there? Johnny Stompanato in the darkness. And over the next several hours, Johnny beats her. Within an inch of her life. Cheryl can hear the violence between the walls, and she doesn't know whether to call police or just put the pillow over her head. She ultimately doesn't call police, and at the end of this very violent night, and Lana's been beaten by this guy before, and she knows how to cover her bruises. But Johnny Stompanato makes the ultimate, bad mistake for a dumb gangster like him. He not only threatens to kill her, he's done that before, Sara. Now he says, I'm going to kill your mother and I'm going to kill your kid. Now, I think that's when Mama Bear and Lana Turner said, oh, okay, police aren't going to help me. I've got to take this matter into my own hands. It's going to be me or it's going to be him.
And it's interesting because in my research, I found that the majority of murders are committed by men, and the very few that are committed by women are almost always in defense of self or child, whereas men tend to murder for primal reasons like greed, rage, jealousy, for money. But women, when they rarely do murder to save their lives or the lives of their children. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
I think that's what we saw here. And the popular culture theory about the Lana Turner case is that her 14-year-old daughter was breaking up a fight between Lana and Johnny and stuck Johnny in the back or in the abdomen with a knife, killing him. That didn't happen. And all of the research that I uncovered proves that didn't happen. Not that I would ever call Cheryl Crane, the daughter, a liar. I don't think she is at all. Cheryl ended up writing her own book about what she had gone through, with her mother. And it's a very tragic story about living in the shadow of a star like Lana Turner. And Cheryl has always claimed responsibility for Johnny Stampanato's death. But I think she did that because she wanted to protect her mom. At any time in Lana's life, she could have been charged with capital murder, which is one of the things that I found really interesting, Sara, in my research, is that after the killing, there's a wrongful death suit filed against Lana Turner from the family of Johnny Stampanato. Now, if you were innocent, you would fight that wrongful death suit in court. Lana doesn't do that. She settles it out of court because the attorneys knew that they could put the knife in her hands and that they could, hold her civilly responsible for his death, therefore opening up the door for criminal prosecution.
And interestingly, the first call that Lana makes is not to the police, as you might assume, but actually to a very strategic Hollywood lawyer, Jerry Geisler. Yeah,
Jerry Geisler was basically the Johnny Cochran of the 1950s, or Johnny was the Gary Geisler of the 1990s. There was a rally cry for any Hollywood celebrity that ever got in trouble that was, "Get me Geisler." Whether it was Robert Mitchum, who got busted for pot, Errol Flynn, who got busted for a litany of crimes, Charlie Chaplin, you name it. And Lana calls him before she calls Beverly Hills Police. And Jerry gets there and sizes up the crime scene. And what I've learned and what I've heard from people that had relatives who were in that room that night, they said it was a bloodbath, that Johnny was stabbed and that Lana was the culprit and that they had to, use the 90 minutes they could to clean that scene as best as they could before they ended up calling Beverly Hills Police. Not the LAPD. LAPD would have sniffed this out in 2 seconds. Beverly Hills cops, they didn't really get a lot of homicides. And, when a Jerry Geisler tells them what happened, well, they take it. And remember, Sara, Johnny wasn't a judge. He wasn't a doctor. He was a gangster. He was a killer. He was a thug. Somebody was going to take him off the map. And if it was Lana or a 14-year-old kid, so be it.
Casey, what shocked or surprised you the most about this case?
I would say, again, the extortion plot against Lana and everything that she had gone through. And, there is one piece of the book that I love to write. It's a confrontation that Johnny Stampanato has with Sean Connery. Sean Connery was an unknown actor. Lana hired him for his first film that she co-starred in. They filmed it in England, and Johnny's hearing that there's romance on the set. So he forges a passport, he gets a gun, he shows up in England and London, and he brings the gun to the set. And he puts that gun right in front of Sean Connery, and Sean Connery becomes James Bond in that moment and kicks the living crap out of Johnny Stampanato, which is what, I love to write that because that guy had it coming.
That is also one of my favorite scenes. Let me ask you this. What is the one question that you would ask Lana if she was alive today?
That's a great question. I would say, why did you take the gamble in terms of putting the knife in Cheryl's hands? Because I believe her lawyer said, look, I can get justifiable homicide for a 14-year-old girl. All of the, the jurors and the prosecutors, they all have daughters. They can empathize with somebody like that. It's different. You've been beaten. That's premeditation if you've killed him. So, but again, I think Lana, put all of her chips in with Jerry Giesler. And as you read, Sara, there is a moment in time where they didn't know if that gamble would pay off. And I'm sure that those moments, Lana wondered if she had ever done the right thing.
It is a large gamble. Casey, I read again in your acknowledgments that you have a wife and 2 daughters. How has parenting 2 daughters changed how you write true crime and how you write female victims?
And that's a great question. As I said, I always try to get, find the agency of these victims. When I wrote Helltown about a brutal serial murderer in Provincetown, Massachusetts, I leaned in to the women that he killed because I know what that feels like. My aunt was murdered in 1964, 5 years before I was born, into an Irish Catholic household on Cape Cod. But I know the hole that a murder like that and a senseless crime like that leaves. It's generational, which is what it is. So every time I'm writing in a female voice, so to speak, I'm a 55-year-old guy, but I always think about my daughters. I always think about my Aunt Mary. And as I said, I felt very paternal for Lana. As many mistakes as she made, and I'm researching this, I'm like, don't do this, Lana. Don't do this. Oh, all right, now we got to get you out of this, Lana. So, again, I think it opened my eyes quite a bit.
Final question from me. Casey, what is one thing that you've never shared about this book or your research process that you would like to confess today to all of us?
The one thing I didn't share, I did put my feet into Lana Turner's cement imprint at Grauman's Chinese Theater. She actually, my foot is a lot bigger than hers, and my hand obviously is smaller than hers. So, but with that visit really made her come alive to me and really showed me that this was a very important person in the history of Hollywood. And she's all been, forgotten by many. People don't really know who she is. And I think hopefully this book, allows people to get to know her in a much different way than she has been categorized, since the 1940s.
Wait, but her footprints are in high heels.
I know. Again, it's embarrassing.
Were you that authentic, Casey? Did you put your feet in high heels? I need to know.
I've got Barney Rubble feet, Sara. I don't think my feet could be put into high heels. But again, just knowing that, her hands were there at some time, touching and feeling that type of history got me a little closer to her, I think. And what I love about Lana is, and I end the book not in a very tragic way. I end it at a moment between mother and daughter where they own the night again. And I thought it was a beautiful moment between the two because they did have a, tumultuous relationship all the way toward, Lana's death. But I love the fact that Lana outlived Johnny Stompanato. She outlived Mickey Cohen. She was on Love Boat, for God's sakes, in the 1980s. She was on Falcon Crest with Lorenzo Lamas. Here's a woman that survived, and I think, today's actor, male and female, they owe a debt of gratitude toward Lana Turner.
Well said. Well, what a perfect note to segue now to your questions. What questions Miss Mary have, my amazing co-chair and the co-founder of this festival?
It's so much fun to get to hear this. I'm not usually the murder mystery fan, but really, first of all, you're so dynamic, Casey. It's incredible. Sara, so interesting about murder, women versus men, and of course, intuitively as women, we say we understand that. That has a very weird echo, and Casey, you probably followed this. Charlize Theron in South Africa and her mother. Mm-hmm. Isn't there an eerie echo there?
Actually, that's a great question, and we're having conversations with Charlize right now about playing Lana Turner in the feature film. We're, working, as we all know, development on any feature film can take 12 months or it can take 12 years. So my partner in this project is Terrence Winter. Terrence created Boardwalk Empire for HBO. He was one of the lead writers of The Sopranos and was nominated for an Oscar for Wolf of Wall Street. And I reached out to Terry just looking for a blurb for the book. And within 24 hours, he said, has anybody optioned this yet? And I said, no. He goes, well, would you partner with me on it? And now what we're doing is we're having conversations with, the top echelon of all the leading Hollywood actresses in the world. We're also having conversations with the strongest female directors. We want a strong female director to direct this movie, who has a different point of view than Terry or than myself. So, we want to gain that power and put it on the big screen in a big way.
Bravo. We'll be cheering you on.
I apologize, I have a pair of questions. The easy one, Helltown. You have dialogue between the girl who's murdered and her murderer in the last hours before she dies. Where did you get that dialogue from? Did you make it up? Was it from his writing and
Well, yeah,
plus his writing?
Part one, Tony Costa, the killer in Helltown. He was one of the most brutal serial killers that ever lived. He was also an aspiring author, which is weird, but that's what happens.
It's probably why he did it.
He wrote his own manuscript called Resurrection, and it was unpublished. But I gained access to it. He wrote it in prison before he was killed. So those are the conversations that he had, to his recollection, with Sidney Monson, with Susan Perry, with all of the other victims here. And I wanted to, share those moments. So it's really, for the first time in any book that I've ever written, that I can take you into the mind of a serial killer and take you into those moments before he brings out the blade or a gun.
But then you're trusting him, which is questionable. And my second question is, you said a family member of yours was murdered. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. So she lived on 44A Charles Street in Boston's Beacon Hill. She was murdered on January 4th, 1964, at the hands of the alleged Boston Strangler. She was the youngest and final victim in a murder spree from 1962 to 1964. I reinvestigated the case and was able to prove that there were multiple killers committing these assaults against women in Boston. And the police knew it. And I have all the files and I've done all the interviews. I actually had to exhume my aunt's remains for DNA testing and exhume the remains of Albert DeSalvo, the so-called Boston Strangler. I've actually held his skull in my hands. That's how close you get into these cases. So, to me, it's more terrifying to know it wasn't Jack the Ripper murdering women in Boston. It was men who had motives of passion, who committed these crimes. And that to me is scary.
So when you exhumed your aunt, the DNA was still intact?
DNA after 40 years was still intact in her body. It was, and I was working with Dr. Michael Baden, Dr. Henry Lee. These were the forensic scientists that were leading, cutting edge technology in the early 2000s. And they did find her DNA, or the killer's DNA, on her body. It didn't match Albert DeSalvo, but it was a partial match, mitochondrially speaking, to the real suspect in her case, who was a 19-year-old Boston University student who failed 3 lie detector tests, was put at the scene of the crime by the only witness. That guy later became a golf pro in northern New England. So when I wrote my first book, A Rose for Mary, I felt I owed him his turn to tell his story. I tried to call him, but he'd hang up on me, so I booked a golf lesson under an assumed name. And I met him at the golf course, and we did have this really bizarre confrontation.
How far into the lesson did you reveal your real reason for being there? Because I would stay close to the first tee if I was with a murderer.
He knew right away. He said, what do you want to work on, your long game or your short game? And I should have said both. And he's like, wait, you don't even play golf. And he was right, I don't play golf. So I took off my hat and my glasses, and I said, I'm not Wayne Rose, I'm Casey Sherman, and I'm here to talk about Mary Sullivan. And at first, he didn't want to talk. He said, call my lawyer. And then all he could do was talk. And one thing that was eerie to me was that a pronounced stutter came out about halfway into the conversation. And why I leaned on that was 2 weeks after my aunt was killed, one of her roommates got a call from a young man who was drunk who had a very pronounced stutter. And he said, I'm going to do to you what I did to that Mary bitch. And 40 years later, I'm hearing that voice within 6 feet or 6 inches from me.
Wow. So, but
No, he was actually dating her roommate. So it was personal, but not what you think. She was moving into her apartment at 44A Charles Street that day. He had broken into the apartment to get information that his girlfriend was cheating on him. She was a 19-year-old kid. She didn't, he didn't know she was there. Mary discovers this. She's a tough Irish girl from a tough Irish family. An argument happens, then it becomes physical. He's stronger than her. He murders her, and then he decorates the crime scene. When I say that is he left a Happy New Year card placed by her left foot. He assaulted her with a broomstick.
What did he leave by her hand?
Happy New Year card. She was murdered on January 4th. So this was what police saw when they entered the apartment that day. And I spent a dozen years with the lead investigator in her murder in 1964, and he was convinced it wasn't Albert DeSalvo, but he was convinced that it was this other, suspect that they had, who I ended up confronting in New Hampshire. Yep.
Wow. Yes, ma'am. Oh, can we get the mic over here?
I have a mic.
Oh, okay, then we'll get to you next.
As someone who lived across the street from the Provincetown Dunes, for many years, I was especially struck in Helltown how the book ended about your postulation of who was the lady in the dunes. So now we know who the lady in the dunes was. I wondered, have you been able to talk to her family? And will you write an epilogue?
That's a really good question. I probably will when I learn a little bit more about it, but I didn't get a chance to reach her family, and I was comparing the crime scene photos. I'd seen the crime scene photos of Lady in the Dunes. I had studied all the crime scene photos in Helltown, and the cut marks were nearly identical in all of these murders. Now, the Lady in the Dunes wasn't killed by Tony Costa. Tony Costa was dead and buried by that time. But Tony Costa, who was this very charismatic hippie messiah in Provincetown, was the East Coast version of Charles Manson. He had people that were doing his bidding for him. And when Helltown came out, and I was talking about this with you and your dad, I had a book signing at East End Books in Provincetown, and the signing was abruptly canceled. And when I reached the bookseller, I asked why. He said that, people are still here in the community that may have played a role in those murders, and they're threatening his life. They're threatening to smash his windows and do him harm. So we ended up canceling that book signing about a couple weeks later because everybody in Provincetown had heard about the book. They wanted it. He bought, 5 boxes of the books, and he asked, can you come and sign them? And I did, with my brother, who's a tough Irish guy, and we walked up one end of Commercial Street and the other, and nobody came out, to do us any harm. So, there are keyboard warriors out there that, make these veiled threats, but in this day and age, you got to take them seriously.
Casey, I just want to compliment you on what an amazing writer you are. My uncle was the lead investigator in the Helltown crimes, and when I read your book, certainly growing up with him, he would talk a little bit about it, and he also had 4 daughters, which I can only imagine was very painful. But I felt as though I was sitting in my living room having a conversation with my uncle. That's how good your writing is. So I'll read anything you...
Well, thank you very much. And her uncle was Tom Gunnery, state police investigator who prevented murders of young women. So, kudos to your uncle. He was just an amazing man.
Is Helltown in paperback?
Helltown? Yes, it is, sir. Yes, it is. And there'll be another printing. We're actually turning that into a feature film right now. And anybody that reads Helltown, it's really a story about 2 authors, Kurt Vonnegut and Norman Mailer, that become obsessed with these crimes. And they investigate these crimes. Kurt writes a story about it for Life magazine. Norman fictionalizes it for a book that he wrote later on in his career. So Oscar Isaac is playing Kurt Vonnegut in our feature film. Robert Downey Jr. is my production partner on it. And Ed Berger, who just won a couple of Oscars for All Quiet on the Western Front, is going to direct this. So you surround yourself with amazing talent, like Lisa has in her career and her tremendous success adapting her books to the big screen. It's really about who you work with, right?
I'm happy to say we're selling Helltown in paperback. It's right over here at the table.
Thank you.
And Casey is gesturing and referencing to New York Times bestselling author Lisa Genova, who is in the front row and who has been in the festival twice and whose book Still Alice became the movie and won Julianne Moore the Oscar. Yay!
All right.
Yes, we have a question right there. You're conveniently close.
Casey,
Oh, sir, the microphone is right next to you. Yeah.
That's
Casey,
okay.
Casey, who's playing Norman Mailer?
That we haven't cast them yet. Great question. We have a few actors that we're really interested in. One of the benefits of writing Helltown is that people didn't know Norman Mailer's work. Everybody I think had read Slaughterhouse-Five at some point in their lives. But it's great that people that are true crime fans are now going and learning about Norman, learning about Kurt, and picking up their books and discovering them like I did as a young person, and specifically researching this book.
We have the 4-minute warning, which means we have time for at least 1 or 2 more questions. Who has a question for Casey?
Sure.
Well, I was thinking about Sebastian Junger. He also has a Cape connection, and he wrote about the Boston Strangler as well. And, of course, Mailer wrote about Oswald's Tale. What is it about Cape Cod that produces this type of writer?
It's a quiet, desolate place in those winter months, and, the walls, tend to close in a little bit. I do a lot of my writing, on the Cape, where I can kind of, be alone with my thoughts, as dark as they sometimes are, and I put them on paper as opposed to doing something else.
The good news is we're 30 miles by sea away from that. So
That's right.
we're safe over here. Last question for Casey. Anne, our wonderful Anne Sullivan, member of the board and treasurer.
Thank you. So is the Karen Reed case on your horizon?
Karen Reed case, I think everybody knows the Karen Reed case.
I do
It's
not know the Karen Reed case.
Karen Reed is a woman who is on trial right now in Dedham, Massachusetts, for the murder of her Boston police officer boyfriend. It's one of the most sensational murder cases I think that I've ever, watched from afar. Basically, the defense claims that it was a conspiracy to put Karen Reed in handcuffs, and that a cabal of police officers actually were involved in this murder. It's still being played out in the courtroom. Because it's such a crowded field right now, I'm kind of watching and leaning in a little bit. While the Karen Reed case was unfolding, I decided to write a book which comes out next year called Blood in the Water, and it's about the Nathan Carman case. Now, Nathan was a 16-year-old boy on the spectrum who took his mother out on a deep-sea fishing trip off the coast of Rhode Island in 2016. The boat went down. She disappeared. He was a castaway on a life raft for 8 days before he was picked up by a passing cargo ship. And when they got him back to the Coast Guard headquarters, they started to pick away at his story. And they believed that he had murdered his mother, and then he was also the prime suspect in the shotgun killing of his grandfather 3 years prior, all to seize control of a $50 million family fortune. It makes the Murdaugh case look like a bunch of amateurs. I mean, it's crazy. And I'll leave you with this tease: he may be innocent.
Where does that take place, Casey?
That takes place in Rhode Island. It takes place off the coast of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and even Vermont.
Wow.
Have you looked into the Menendez brothers?
I have, a little bit. I think, that's well-worn territory. If I could bring something new to the Menendez case, I'd kind of lean into it. I like to look at cases that aren't as popular, and people don't have a lot of knowledge about it. People say, when are you going to write about JFK? I'm like, Jesus. I don't know if I have enough time to do that.
No pressure, just JFK.
All right.
Yes, ma'am.
How about Murdaugh?
Yeah, how about those Murdaugh murders?
The Murdaughs, it's a crazy story. It's all about power and greed at the end of the day, and that's one of the primary motives that we see time and time again with all the murders that we cover, all the murders that we write about. Those seem to be, it's passion and it's money. Those seem to be the primary objectives and motives behind all, any of the murders that I've investigated.
The male murders. Us ladies are keeping it clean over here. We murder for self-defense.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I've written about organized crime. I studied Whitey Bulger. I knew him. I know those guys. Their motives are very transparent. They know what they want to do. It's the people that you don't know really what their motives are. Those are the ones to be more terrified about.
Well, what a chilling, perfect note to end on.
Look around, everybody.
Be afraid, but not here, because we're 30 miles away from the Cape. Casey has books to sign, and you can buy those right over there, and Casey will sign and inscribe them. And to continue our tradition, I will also be hiding one copy of Casey's book on this island with a secret message from Casey, and we will be posting clues to find it every single day, which is something that I started last year, and it's so fun that we're keeping it going this year with Casey's book. So be sure to follow Nantucket Book Festival's Instagram to get those daily clues and find that book. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sarah.